Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about two of the most interesting three-row crossovers available in America. At this point in time, if you're shopping for three-row crossover like a Pilot, an Explorer, or a Highlander, something along those lines, and you want a rear-wheel drive vehicle that's a little bit more focused on towing than the average crossover in America, you have basically two options in the mainstream segment. The Dodge Durango, I happen to own a 2018 Durango. Nothing has changed for 2020, but for 2021, we are getting a pretty interesting refresh. And then over here, we have the all-new Ford Explorer. Now, I'll let you in on a little bit of a secret. This Dodge Durango right here is leased. I didn't buy it in 2018. And the reason I didn't buy it is because I knew that this Ford Explorer was going to be coming out very, very soon. And in my head, I had hoped that I would be able to get a Durango and the Explorer would be everything that I was interested in, everything that I wanted in a mid-size three-row crossover, because it was going back to rear-wheel drive. It was supposed to have some more powerful turbocharged engines, an available hybrid. This is the hybrid model right here. And theoretically, it was also supposed to be focused on towing. However, I also have to admit that when this guy's lease is up, I'm probably going to end up either buying it or just getting another Durango. Obviously, I'm going to talk about why that is, but let's get the basics out of the way, how they compare with one another. So up front, we definitely have an older design over here in the Durango. This Durango has been on sale for a really, really long time. This is almost a true automotive dinosaur. The basics of the Durango really date back to the era when Mercedes owned Chrysler, and this is very closely related to the Jeep Grand Cherokee. You can think of the Durango as the three-row Grand Cherokee. Over here, the Explorer has a much more modern look to it. It's a little bit less truck-like, however, and I'm a little bit torn on the looks and which one I prefer, but I have to say, I think if I were going to pick simply on looks, I do like the truck-like look of the Durango, the slightly more pronounced front bumper design, but this unquestionably looks more modern, and we have some more modern tech going on. Full LED headlamps in this trim. My Durango has HID headlamps, although for 2021, we are going to get full LEDs. We also have a 360-degree camera system, which is really, really great on a larger crossover like this, especially if you're going to be using it for towing. We don't have that option on the Durango. With the Explorer, Ford is going about active safety a little bit differently. The big difference is that we get blind spot monitoring standard on all versions rather than radar adaptive cruise control, and blind spot monitoring is optional over there. Now, we still have autonomous braking with pedestrian detection, lane keeping, auto headlights, and rear cross traffic detection standard on the Explorer. The Explorer is a little bit longer than a Toyota Highlander. This is just under 199 inches long. That puts this sort of in the middle of the three-row crossover segment. Generally speaking, three-row crossovers fall into two categories that I really prefer to categorize based on interior volume rather than exterior volume. Definitely keep that in mind. So the Explorer actually has about the same kind of room inside as a Highlander, generally speaking. A little bit more cargo room in the back, slightly larger third row, but not a great deal. And the same thing is true of the Durango over here. The Durango is a little bit less space efficient than the Explorer. This is over 200 inches long, so a little bit longer than that. But on the inside, we have interior room very similar again to the Toyota Highlander. And it's all because of the Durango's design. This was designed for V8 engines under the hood. You can see that we have that much longer hood profile than you'd find in a Pilot or a Highlander, and that really drops cargo practicality down. We also have those more pronounced bumpers up front and in the rear. So if you're looking for more of a bumper style on your next crossover, definitely keep that in mind. Now, some folks are really offended by me calling the Explorer and the Durango crossovers, but in reality, these are the only true crossovers available in the mainstream segment outside a luxury crossover. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take a look at a Highlander or a Pilot, they really have more in common with the average minivan or the average passenger car. They just happen to be shaped like this. But a Durango and an Explorer actually contain some truck componentry. So the Durango has basically the same V8 engine and same automatic transmission that we find in the Ram 1500 lineup. And the Explorer has basically the same engine and transmissions that we find in the Ranger or in the F-150. And of course, both of these are rear-wheel drive, and they're the only rear-wheel drive entries in this segment again. Over here on the Explorer, you can see that the bumper sticks out a little bit, but both have fairly high cargo load heights because we have a little bit more ground clearance than we find in some crossovers out there. Both of these vehicles also have dual exhaust tips, and again, we have that 4-pin and 7-pin wiring harness connection. Very, very similar over here in the Explorer, but the tow rating is much lower. In this hybrid model, you can tow 5,000 pounds, but the most you can tow in any Explorer is still going to be under 6,000 pounds. So technically still a little bit lower than something along the lines of a Nissan Pathfinder. Although I would rather tow with the Explorer than the Pathfinder. This has much better gear ratios, a lot more power under the hood, and rear-wheel drive vehicles tend to feel a little bit different when towing because the power is being applied to the rear wheels right where more weight is going to be if you're going to be putting more tongue weight on your vehicle. For 2021, the changes out back are going to be a little bit more minor than the changes inside the Durango or up front. We're still going to have the LED racetrack light, which I think is pretty distinctive on the Durango. This is one of my favorite styling cues. But again, the Durango feels a little bit older, less modern than the Explorer. They have very similar trailer hitch arrangements down here, however. We have 4-pin and 7-pin wiring harness connections. Everything is very nicely arranged. And one thing that I like on both of these is that the hitch receiver actually sticks out from the bumper a little bit. And some crossovers, especially the front-wheel drive-based crossovers, it's all tucked in there underneath the vehicle, and that makes it harder to put the safety chains and things like that on your tow vehicle. Now, towing is definitely the reason to get the Durango. For 2021, even the 5.7-liter V8 engine will be able to tow 8,700 pounds. In this generation of Durango, V8 towing for the 5.7-liter V8 is just over 7,000 pounds. If you want 8,700 pounds, then you have to step up to the 6.4-liter V8. Things are quite different in the Durango, and in some ways the engine options of these two vehicles slot somewhat in between each other. The Durango starts with a pretty traditional naturally aspirated V6 engine. It's a 3.6-liter model. It produces 295 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque. You then have your choice of 3 different V8 engines for 2021. The 5.7-liter V8 produces 360 horsepower and 390 pound-feet of torque. That's a little bit less power and torque than we find in the Ram 1500. But all of these engines are mated to an 8-speed automatic transmission, so 2 gears less than we find in the Ford. The 5.7-liter Durango has a trick up its sleeve. This is the only vehicle in this segment available with a 2-speed transfer case. So if you're looking for a 3-row crossover, not a 3-row large SUV that's body on frame, and you want a low ratio mode, this is the only option you have. From that point on, you enter the sport trims of the Durango. We get the regular SRT 392 model that produces 475 horsepower out of a 6.4-liter V8 engine, or the absolutely insane SRT Hellcat model, which gives you 710 horsepower out of a 6.2-liter supercharged V8. In this lineup, obviously the highest fuel economy is going to be had in the hybrid version of the Explorer, and the lowest fuel economy is going to be found in the supercharged V8 Durango. But fuel economy is a little bit tricky, so if we're talking about mainline models to mainline models, there's not going to be an enormous difference in real-world fuel economy between the 2.3-liter turbo and the 3.6-liter V6, or the 3-liter twin-turbo in base form and the 5.7-liter V8 in the Durango. It's also worth noting that when towing, the hybrid model of the Ford Explorer actually managed to average just slightly less than the 5.7-liter V8 in the Durango, mainly because of the amount of fuel you're using to climb hills and higher speeds in trailers, etc. So depending on your driving situation, the hybrid will get you better fuel economy as long as you're not towing, but if you are planning on towing with these vehicles, then of course fuel economy is going to be pretty similar. The lowest rated Durango is rated to tow 600 pounds more than the highest rated Explorer at 6,200 pounds for the 3.6-liter V6. If you get the 5.7-liter V8 model, then towing depends on the options that you select. It could be 7,200 pounds, 7,400 pounds, or 8,700 pounds depending on the packages. If you get the 6.4 or the 6.2-liter supercharged engine, then 8,700 pounds is standard. Any way you slice it, 8,700 pounds is an enormous amount of weight for a 3-row vehicle in this segment. And in fact, if you want to tow more in an SUV or a crossover really of any description, you have incredibly few options. The biggest one that comes to mind is the Ford Expedition, significantly more expensive than the Durango or the Explorer, and it's not going to out-tow the Durango by very much. It's rated to tow about 9,300 pounds versus 8,700 pounds in the Dodge. And keep in mind that if you're talking about pulling power and pulling ability, that top-end version of the Expedition isn't going to have the kind of thrust that we find in the Hellcat version of the Durango. The EPA rating on this guy is 17 miles per gallon, but I do have wider tires than came stock with this. I put the SRT wheels and tires on this, so we have 295 with tires here versus 255s over there on the Ford. That should put this at a disadvantage because the EPA rating is 17 miles per gallon, but the Durango has been surprisingly efficient towing in the past, and it does have cylinder deactivation, which will certainly activate even when there are trailers connected. When it comes to seat comfort, personally I find the Durango seats to be a little bit more comfortable than the ones that we find in the Explorer. Range of motion is pretty similar, but top-end versions of the Durango do feel a little bit more comfortable to me. When you hop into the second and third rows, you'll notice that the newer design of the Explorer gives us more room. We have more combined legroom and a little bit more headroom in the second and third rows. So if you are planning on putting larger folks back in the third row, know that the Explorer is going to be a little bit more accommodating. We also have a hair more cargo room, although neither of these models is going to give you as much interior room, legroom, headroom, cargo room, etc. as you find in some of the non-towing focused vehicles out there. The Kia Telluride and the Hyundai Palisade and the Volkswagen Atlas have enormous and cavernous interiors, so if you want a combination of lots of third row room, lots of legroom in general, and a big cargo area, and you still want a 3-row crossover, the Explorer and the Durango are probably not going to be the best fits. You are going to have to give up a bit to get the rear-wheel drive dynamics and, of course, the towing ability that we find in these models. As I said before, it's important to keep in mind that even though the Explorer and the Durango are larger on the outside than a Toyota Highlander, because of the design, especially with the Durango that was designed for some of those big V8 engines to be under the hood, it's just not as space efficient as the Toyota. So we have very similar interior room to the Highlander, even on the outside it is quite a bit bigger. On the flip side, both of these options are far better packaged than most of the full-size SUVs out there. So if you were to take a look at something like a Nissan Armada or a Toyota Sequoia or a Ford Expedition or even a Chevy Tahoe, even the Tahoe has improved for 2021, you're not really going to find more room in those bigger full-size SUVs, even though they're going to be thirstier, they're not going to handle as well, they may not even tow more than the Durango either. On the downside, both the Durango and the Explorer are 6 or 7 passenger vehicles only. There is no 8-seat version of either of these vehicles. When it comes to the interior design, even though the Durango is significantly older than the Explorer, I have to say it's aged pretty well. And I do find the dashboard design to be pretty relevant. The infotainment system, even if you get the 8.4-inch infotainment system, which is continuing on for 2021 in the low-end trims, it's snappier, more responsive, and a little bit easier to use than the sync system that we find in the Explorer. And then if you get the top-end trims of the 2021 Durango, we oddly enough get FCA's latest infotainment system, Uconnect 5. The Durango and the Pacifica are the only two vehicles to get this brand new infotainment system. It's modeled on the Android operating system. The displays are 4 times higher resolution than the 8.4-inch screen that we find in the 2020 Durangos, and everything appears to be snappier and easier to use. It also supports wireless Android Auto and wireless Apple CarPlay if that's something that you're interested in. The revised dashboard design that we find in the 2021 Durango does not extend to revised doors, however, so the door trims still look a little bit outdated, really, compared to what we see in the Ford, and of course, most of the 3-row crossovers out there. That's one of my complaints about the interior of the Durango, is that the stitched dashboard really dresses things up. The infotainment system is nice and modern, but once your eyes start lowering yourself down that upper level of the dashboard, you'll notice that some of the hard plastics creep into the interior in places that we just don't find in the Explorer or in most of the competition. As you'd expect out on the road, the Explorer is neater and tidier feeling than the Durango. The heaviest version of the Explorer is about the same weight as the lightest version of the Durango. The Durango is a pretty heavy vehicle. If you get the absolute top-end version of the Durango with a 6.2-liter supercharged engine, it is over 1,000 pounds heavier than the heaviest version of the Explorer. That's one of the reasons that performance figures tend to slot between models. So the base version of the Explorer is faster than the Durango in base form, even though they produce relatively similar power. Then we get the 5.7-liter V8 in the Durango that's going to be a little bit faster than that. Then we get the 3-liter twin-turbo engines in the Ford Explorer. Even though they produce similar power to the 5.7-liter, they're going to get you 0 to 60 faster. Of course, the ST model of the Explorer is going to be faster still. But it's not going to be quite as fast as the 6.4-liter V8 engine that we find in the Durango because A, it produces less power, and B, the Durango has some pretty aggressive gearing in that SRT model. And then obviously, at the very pinnacle of this segment is going to be the absolutely insane SRT Hellcat. That will get you 0 to 60 in under 3.5 seconds in a nearly 3-ton vehicle. Braking scores also tend to fall intermixed here because it really depends on the options that you get and the tire size that you end up with. The widest tires available are going to be in the top-end performance versions of the Durango. That would be the RT with the tow and go, so 5.7, 6.4, and 6.2 all have really great stopping distances because you can get them with wide tires. 295 with tires. All-season performance tires or summer tires are available on the Durango as well. Tire size in the Ford Explorer ends up being a little bit smaller. The brakes end up being a little bit smaller. It still posts very respectable 60 to 0 stopping distances, but the ST Explorer is not quite the same level of crazy and same level of performance improvement that we find in the SRT product line. And that's why pricing falls a little bit in between as well. Remember that the ST version of the Explorer is not as expensive as the SRT Durango, so you shouldn't really expect the same level of differentiation. When it comes to handling, clearly the win has to go to the Explorer. It really does feel like an American discount BMW X5. That's not a bad thing at all. The Durango has a solid feel to it out on the road, but it certainly feels bigger, it feels heavier, and if you get the 3.6 or 5.7-liter engines in your Durango, then the rear end does have sort of a lightness to it that is a little bit unusual. It takes some getting used to. If you start pushing it even harder in the corners, then the rear end does settle down a little bit, but it has some rear end float that can be a bit disconcerting. Oddly enough, the 6.4 and 6.2-liter models, even though they're even heavier up front, don't exhibit that same tendency. It seems to have to do with the way that the rear suspension is designed. And this is something that you seem to notice a bit more if you get the 5.7 with the load leveling suspension. There are a ton of options available on the Durango, a ton of different suspension tunes available as well. So keep in mind that it's going to feel a little bit different if you get the base 3.6, the 5.7 with the load leveling suspension, the 5.7 with the adaptive suspension, or the 6.4 or 6.2 suspensions as well. Regardless of the model that you get, ride quality is going to be better in the Durango. I attribute that mainly to the fact that it's a larger and heavier vehicle and has a slightly different suspension tune. It wasn't going after the same kind of shopper that the Explorer was going after. The Explorer is definitely focused on driving dynamics, but also being very competitive with the front-wheel drive entries. So the biggest competitor to the Ford Explorer, according to Ford, is the Highlander and the Pilot. And that makes sense when you take a look at the way the Explorer is packaged and it's priced. It's very similarly sized inside, similarly powerful, etc. But the top-end versions are trying to compete with some of the European alternatives. It definitely has far more power than we find available in anything outside the Durango lineup. When it comes to fuel economy, clearly the winner here is going to be the Ford Explorer as well, but there are a few caveats. If you're towing, then really no version of the Explorer is going to be getting better fuel economy than the comparably powerful Durango. If you want to know more about that, be sure and check out my hybrid versus V8 towing comparison video. I tested these two vehicles with a trailer attached to them, did a fuel economy test loop, and the two vehicles were surprisingly similar, even though the hybrid Explorer was rear-wheel drive with skinnier tires and theoretically a much higher EPA rating. It mainly had to do with how much fuel the vehicles were consuming when they were climbing a hill. Now let's dive into the pricing. The Durango SXT rear-wheel drive is going to be the least expensive option here. It starts at $31,765. That's notably less than the base Explorer. The Durango is pretty well equipped for 2021 as well. Bear in mind that that base version of the Durango is not going to get the new Uconnect 5 infotainment system with the large 10-inch LCD. If you want all-wheel drive, the Durango and Explorer end up pretty similarly priced at around $34,600 for the Explorer, about $300 less or so for the Durango. If you want the V8 power in your Durango, that's going to set you back at least $45,305. The comparable model in the Ford lineup would sort of be the ST version. That's the least expensive way to get that twin-turbo V6 at $52,605. That's pretty similar to the Durango RT all-wheel drive at $47,905. In ST form, the Explorer gets a few more performance modifications than we find in RT form in the Durango, so that price difference makes a lot of sense. You should keep in mind that if you get the 5.7-liter V8 in the Durango, you do get one thing that you don't find in the Explorer at any price, and that is the 2-speed transfer case. If you want the Citadel model of Durango, that's the luxury version, that's going to be $47,805, but that brings with it the 3.6-liter V6 or the 5.7. You have to pay extra for the 5.7, and that's why it's less expensive than the Platinum version of the Explorer. By the time you've added that 5.7-liter V8, it's going to end up pretty similar to the all-wheel drive Platinum trim. The intriguing option in the Durango lineup is the Durango RT all-wheel drive tow and go at $52,900. That gets you 8,700 pounds of towing capacity, the brakes, tires, and a bunch of other stuff from the SRT lineup. It's really an interesting blend. It also gets the same adaptive suspension system and the variable transfer case in the center that we find in those SRT models as well. So it ditches the 2-speed transfer case for a variable torque distribution transfer case, and that's part of what helps get you up to that 8,700 pounds. Which vehicle would I get if my own cash were on the line is something that I had to consider back in 2018 when I got my Durango, and I'm having to consider again because in 2021, early 2021, my Durango's lease is up. So which vehicle do I get? Well, if you don't need to tow much, I would certainly get the Ford Explorer. I would stick the Explorer Hybrid, however, at the bottom of the list because the smoothness of that hybrid system and the fuel economy just weren't where I expected it to be, but the rest of the Explorer lineup is certainly solid. If you're planning on towing between 5,000 and 6,000 pounds, the 2.3-liter engine in the Explorer should be just fine. I love the way that performs. Better fuel economy than, generally speaking, the 5.7-liter V8 that we find in the Durango. It has excellent performance on the road as well when the trailer's not connected. When the trailer is connected, the fuel economy is not going to be too far off the 5.7-liter V8 in the Durango, but it is going to be giving you better fuel economy when the trailer is not connected. The Explorer also has a more modern feel to it, has a slightly larger interior, and a slightly larger cargo area as well. On the other hand, if you need to tow, the Durango really is the only way to go. It's also worth noting that if you like some of the luxury features or performance features that we find in the Durango, you're quite simply not going to find them in the Explorer. If you want insane 0 to 60 times, you'll find them on the 6.4-liter V8 Durango. You'll also definitely find them on the 6.2-liter V8 version of the Durango. And for 2021, the Durango SRT 392 sort of makes a little bit more sense in my head. It isn't cheap. It starts at $63,000, but you can certainly get your Explorer up to nearly $55,000 or $56,000 in that range. So it's not an enormous leap to get up into that SRT Durango. You get a reasonable amount more performance, you get greater towing ability, and just a different feel as well. The 6.4-liter V8 also has an incredible sound to it. Now, what if you're looking for 8 seats, or more interior room, or the best interior in this segment, or the best infotainment in this segment, or a bunch of other categories? You would need to look at something other than either of these two options. There's definitely a solid reason to buy the Highlander Hybrid, for instance. You can get 8 seats in it, you can get 36 miles per gallon, it has an all-wheel drive system that's relatively capable, definitely suitable for daily driving. If you're looking for the roomiest interior that won't break the bank, that would certainly be something like the Telluride or the Palisade. The Atlas also is in the running. The Atlas is probably going to be the most child seat friendly vehicle in this group. It'll allow you to leave child seats latched into place and still easily access the third row. But of course, I'm not here to talk about those options. I'm here to talk about the Durango versus the Explorer. So if my money were on the line right now, I would probably have to get the Durango. I'm really not sure what I'm going to do with my current Durango, what I'm going to do when April rolls around. You'll have to stay tuned for that. I'm exploring a lot of options. I'm not entirely clear where I will be by that point. Maybe it will be time for a pickup truck. Maybe the Ford F-150 Hybrid looks pretty interesting. Maybe a Ram 1500. Maybe a GMC Sierra with the diesel and the refreshed interior if that comes out in time. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you pick if you were shopping between these two choices right now. I'll see all of you next week.